Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Merlin had felt the disturbance for weeks. The ripples of magic stretched across Camelot like invisible threads, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. But tonight, the surge was undeniably a sharp pulse that caused the ancient stone walls of his chamber to tremble slightly. His hand hovered over a glowing orb on his desk, the magical artifact flickering in response to the fluctuations of time itself. The time array was out of balance. He stood abruptly, his long robes trailing behind him as he strode toward the hidden passage beneath Camelot. Few knew of its existence, even fewer understood its purpose. But Merlin had always known that deep below the surface of the kingdom lay an ancient power, a power that had long been kept in check. Until now. His staff clicked against the cold stone as he descended into the dimly lit tunnels, his thoughts racing with possibilities. He suspected Morgana's hand in this, though the scope of what she intended remained a mystery. After minutes of navigating the labyrinthine passageways, he reached a chamber sealed by a door of shimmering light. Merlin muttered a quick incantation, and the door parted, revealing the heart of the time array, a vast circular structure etched with glowing runes and complex symbols. At its center, time itself seemed to twist and fold, overlapping in strange ways. Merlin's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, the air around him warping, faint whispers of the past and future brushing against his ears. The array was not just malfunctioning, it was breaking apart. Suddenly, the shadows shifted behind him. Merlin whirled, staff raised, his body tense with anticipation. From the darkness emerged Morgana, her eyes gleaming with triumph, her dark robes flowed like liquid night, and her smirk sent a chill down Merlin's spine. "Ah, Merlin, always one step behind, aren't you?" she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "What have you done, Morgana?" Merlin's voice was calm, but his heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the unstable magic crackling in the air, ready to tear time asunder. Morgana's smile widened as she slowly approached the array. "I've simply unlocked the true potential of the time array. This power-broken bar, it can rewrite history, bend time to my will, and with it, I will erase Arthur from existence. Camelot will never know his rule. His legacy, his throne, will belong to me." Merlin's stomach lurched. The implications of Morgana's plan were far worse than he had imagined. She didn't just want to defeat Arthur, she wanted to undo his very being, to warp the past so that he never existed at all. The consequences of such an act would be catastrophic. Time, once broken, could never be truly mended. "You'll destroy everything," Merlin said, stepping between her and the array. "Time cannot be manipulated like this. It's too fragile." "Perhaps," Morgana mused, her tone mocking. "But the future I see without Arthur is one where I rule, one where I am finally free of his shadow and yours." Merlin's grip tightened on his staff. "I won't let you do this." A flicker of annoyance crossed Morgana's face, but she quickly masked it with cold indifference. "You can try to stop me, Merlin, but time is already unraveling. Soon, even you won't be able to hold it together." Without another word, she raised her hands, dark magic swirling around her fingertips. The array pulsed with energy, and the chamber seemed to shudder as time itself rippled outward. Merlin had no choice. He unleashed a powerful counterspell, and the two forces collided, sending sparks of energy cascading across the chamber. But even as Merlin battled Morgana, he could feel the cracks in time widening. Ghostly images flickered around the figures from the past and future, their voices overlapping in a dissonant chorus. Merlin knew that this fight was only the beginning. The time array had been damaged, and if it wasn't repaired soon, Camelot's past, present, and future would collapse into one chaotic timeline. With a final surge of magic, Merlin pushed Morgana back, forcing her to retreat into the shadows. But before she disappeared completely, she cast one last glance over her shoulder, her voice echoing in the chamber. "This is only the beginning, Merlin. You cannot stop what's coming." As the echoes of her words faded, Merlin turned to face the array. It pulsed erratically, the once stable runes flickering like dying embers. He knew he had to act quickly, but he couldn't do it alone. Morgana's tampering had set events in motion that were beyond his control. There was only one person who could help him now, Arthur. The king was in the training yard, his sword flashing in the midday sun as he sparred with several knights. His golden armor gleamed with the radiance of a ruler born to lead, and his movements were fluid, precise. To the outside eye, Arthur looked invincible, but Merlin knew better. He saw the weight of destiny that hung over the young king, a burden that would only grow heavier in the days to come. Merlin approached quietly, watching as Arthur disarmed his opponent with a swift, elegant motion. The young knight stumbled back, breathless, but Arthur merely clapped him on the shoulder with a grin, offering words of encouragement. It was one of Arthur's greatest strengths, his ability to inspire loyalty in those around him. Merlin could only hope it would be enough for what lay ahead. When Arthur finally noticed Merlin, he sheathed his sword and wiped the sweat from his brow, his expression shifting to one of concern. "Merlin," he said, "you look troubled." "What is it?" Merlin hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. How could he explain the gravity of what was happening without overwhelming Arthur with fear? But there was no time for delicacy. The longer they waited, the more fragile time became. "There's been a disturbance," Merlin said, choosing his words carefully. "The time array beneath Camelot, it's broken." Arthur frowned. "The time array? I thought that was only a legend." "It's very real," Merlin said gravely, "and it's been damaged. Morgana is using it to rewrite Historia to erase you from existence." Arthur's eyes widened, but he remained composed. "What can we do?" Merlin felt a surge of relief at Arthur's calm response. He knew the king would not shy away from this challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. "We need to repair the array," Merlin said. "But it won't be easy. Morgana's magic has destabilized it, and now time is bleeding through. We'll have to journey through both the past and the future to gather the components needed to fix it." Arthur nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Then we have no time to lose." Merlin allowed himself a small smile. Despite the peril they faced, he knew that with Arthur by his side, they had a chance. But even as they prepared to embark on this dangerous journey, Merlin couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling Arthur, something he had seen in the flickers of time that filled him with dread. He would reveal the truth when the time was right. But for now, they had a timeline to save. Their journey began at twilight, when the veil between time felt thinnest. Merlin led Arthur back down to the hidden chamber beneath Camelot, where the time array pulsed with chaotic energy. Runes flickered in and out of existence, and the air felt thick with the weight of countless moments overlapping. Merlin stood at the edge of the array, his fingers tracing the glowing symbols in the air. He muttered a low incantation, and the array responded, shifting and warping. Slowly, the center of the array opened, revealing a shimmering portal. "Once we step through, we'll be at the mercy of time itself," Merlin said quietly. "We must be careful." Arthur gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, his face set with resolve. "Lead the way, Merlin." Without further hesitation, Merlin stepped into the portal, and Arthur followed close behind. They emerged in a world that seemed both familiar and strange. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, but the landscape was dotted with structures that did not belong to their time. In the distance, Merlin could see the familiar towers of Camelot, but the city was in its infancy, barely a shadow of the kingdom it would one day become. "We're in the past," Merlin said softly. Arthur stared at the fledgling city in awe. "Is this a broken bar Camelot?" Merlin nodded. "Before it became the Camelot we know." As they made their way toward the early settlement, they encountered figures from Historia, men and women whose names had long since faded from memory, but whose actions had shaped the kingdom's future. Arthur was silent as they walked among the people who had built Camelot from the ground up, his expression contemplative. But Merlin could sense the disturbance in time growing stronger. The further they ventured into the past, the more fragmented reality became. Merlin's pace quickened as the disturbances in time became more pronounced. He could feel the fractures widening, each step forward rippling with unstable energy. Arthur followed in silence, but Merlin could sense the questions weighing on his mind. They were walking through a version of Camelot that neither of them had ever seen, a Camelot that existed before destiny took its course. As they approached the heart of the settlement, a figure appeared in the distance. Tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in armor that gleamed even in the pale light of the setting sun, the man was unmistakable. Merlin recognized him instantly, and the shock of seeing him brought a lump to his throat. It was Uther Pendragon. Arthur froze at the sight of his father, his eyes wide with disbelief. Uther, the once mighty king of Camelot, stood as a younger man, leading his knights in training drills. He barked commands, his voice sharp and commanding, every inch the warrior Arthur had always known him to be. "He's alive," Arthur whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "He's younger." Merlin nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Uther. "This is the past, Arthur. A time before you were born." Arthur's expression shifted from amazement to confusion. "If this is the past, and my father's here, then we can talk to him. Can't we?" "Warn him?" Merlin shook his head, a note of caution in his voice. "We mustn't interfere with events that have already occurred. The risk of altering time further is too great." Arthur clenched his fists, clearly struggling with the idea. To see his father again, to hear his voice, and yet not be able to speak to him, and Merlin could only imagine the pain it caused. But Arthur nodded reluctantly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Merlin knew this journey would test Arthur in more ways than one. They pressed forward, moving through the training grounds without drawing attention to themselves. Merlin's magic cloaked them from view, ensuring that they remained unseen as they made their way toward the center of the ancient settlement. But the closer they got, the more fragmented the world around them became. Time itself seemed to flicker, and Merlin could see glimpses of different eras bleeding into each other, phantom images of Camelot's future, echoes of battles long past. Then, suddenly, the world around them shattered. In an instant, they were no longer in the past. The ground beneath their feet gave way to a swirling vortex of color and light, and for a moment, Merlin felt as though they were falling through the very fabric of time. Arthur cried out, grabbing Merlin's arm as the world spun wildly around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Merlin staggered, trying to regain his bearings. When he looked around, he realized they had been thrown into the future. The landscape was unfamiliar, the air thick with a strange, metallic scent. The sky was a dull gray, and the towers of Camelot, once proud and strong, were crumbling ruins. The city lay in desolation, abandoned and broken. Arthur's face paled at the sight. "What a broken bar! What happened here?" Merlin's chest tightened. He knew what this was. This was a future where Morgana's plan had succeeded. A future where Arthur had been erased, and Camelot had fallen into ruin. "This is what Morgana wants," Merlin said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. "A world without you. A world where Camelot never rose to greatness." Arthur stared at the broken city, his hands trembling at his sides. "We have to stop her." Merlin nodded, but his mind was racing. They had been thrown into this future by the instability of the time array, and it was only growing worse. They couldn't stay here for long, or they risked being trapped in this shattered timeline forever. But just as they turned to leave, they were not alone. Out of the shadows stepped a figure draped in a dark cloak. The figure moved with a strange, jerking motion, as though time itself had warped their very being. As they came closer, Merlin saw the glint of steel beneath the cloak. Arthur drew his sword instinctively, stepping protectively in front of Merlin. "Who are you?" The figure stopped, lowering their hood to reveal a face both familiar and disturbing. It was Morgana, but not as they had known her. This was a version of Morgana from the future, a twisted, broken reflection of the woman they faced in their own time. Her eyes gleamed with madness, and her smile was cold and cruel. "You're too late," she whispered, her voice barely more than a hiss. "This future is already set in stone." Merlin stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with warning. "This is just one possibility. We can still fix the array. We can still stop this." Morgana laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You fool! The array is beyond saving. Time itself is collapsing, and when it's done, nothing will remain, and not you, not Arthur, not Camelot." Arthur tightened his grip on his sword, his eyes narrowing. "We won't let that happen." With a sudden, violent motion, Morgana flung her hands out, dark magic swirling around her in a storm of power. Arthur barely had time to raise his sword before she launched her attack. Merlin reacted instinctively, summoning a barrier of shimmering light that absorbed the brunt of the spell, but the force of it knocked them both back. Morgana advanced, her face twisted with rage. "You think you can still stop me? I've seen this future. I've lived it. And in every version of this story, you lose." Merlin staggered to his feet, his staff glowing with power. He knew this wasn't the Morgana they had come to stop at. This was a version of her twisted by the broken timeline, a manifestation of what could happen if they failed. But her power was real, and if they didn't find a way out of this fractured future soon, they might not make it back at all. Arthur leapt forward, his sword clashing with Morgana's magic, sparks flying as the two forces collided. Merlin, using all his strength, called upon the ancient runes of time, weaving a spell that would anchor them back to the present. But it was taking too long. Morgana's attacks were relentless, and the cracks in time around them were growing wider by the second. With a final, desperate push, Merlin completed the spell, and the ground beneath them shifted once more. The world dissolved into light, and they were pulled from the future just as the walls of time began to collapse. When the light faded, they found themselves back in the present, standing in the chamber with the broken time array. Merlin collapsed to his knees, his body trembling from the strain of the spell. Arthur stood over him, his face pale but determined. "We need to fix this, Merlin," Arthur said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos they had just endured. "We have to stop Morgana." Merlin nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavily on him. They had seen the past, they had glimpsed a terrible future, and now they were running out of time to put things right. But as he looked at the broken time array before him, Merlin couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come.